Chapter 3: The Awakening. The first thing Marco noticed was silence, not the mere absence of sound, but a different kind of silence entirely, dense and absolute, as if the world had been wrapped in layers of wax and cotton, muffling even the whisper of his own breath. It was the silence of tombs, of spaces where life had been systematically extracted and replaced with something else entirely. The familiar background hum of existence, the subtle vibrations of air conditioning, the distant murmur of traffic, the almost inaudible electrical buzz of lights, all of it had been swallowed by this oppressive void that seemed to press against his eardrums like deep water. Then sensation returned, piece by careful piece, each input arriving with crystalline clarity that hurt to process. First came the weight of his head against the steel slab, but it felt wrong now, heavier and lighter at the same time, as if his skull had been filled with liquid mercury that shifted with each movement. The cold of the metal beneath him penetrated through his skin in ways that felt almost intimate, as if the boundary between his flesh and the world had become permeable, undefined. Something thick and viscous was sliding down his cheek in a slow, deliberate trail that felt like a slug made of ice. He tried to lift a hand to wipe it away, but his fingers moved with a strange, underwater sluggishness, as if the air itself had become thick as honey. When his fingertips finally made contact with his face, they came away black and glistening with a substance that reflected light like oil but had the consistency of syrup. His eyes opened, and immediately he knew that something fundamental had changed in the architecture of his perception. The world was sharper now, every edge and angle etched with unnatural clarity that made his retinas ache. Color seemed more vivid and simultaneously more alien, as if he was seeing wavelengths of light that human eyes had never been designed to process. The ceiling tiles above him didn't just exist, they glowed faintly with their own internal luminescence, every hairline crack in the plaster becoming a map of phosphorescent veins that pulsed in rhythm with something he couldn't identify. The fluorescent lights overhead had taken on a quality of liquid fire. Their buzz no longer audible but somehow felt as a vibration in his bones. Dust motes drifted through the air like microscopic galaxies, each particle catching and refracting light in ways that created tiny rainbow coronas around them. The very molecules of the atmosphere seemed visible, a dancing curtain of atomic motion that made the air look thick and almost breathable in a way that suggested it had substance, weight, presence. He turned his head with mechanical precision, the movement smooth and deliberate in a way that felt rehearsed, and saw Emily staring at him from the adjacent slab. Her face was a mask of porcelain perfection, skin pale and flawless but somehow wrong, as if all the minor imperfections that made her human had been carefully edited out by an obsessive artist. Her pupils were perfect black circles that reflected his image back at him like twin mirrors made of obsidian. They did not blink, hadn't blinked once since he'd been watching, he realized with growing unease. Her chest rose and fell with metronomic regularity, but there was no life in the movement, just the mechanical operation of lungs that continued to function because they had been programmed to do so. The breathing tube was gone, leaving only a small, perfectly round hole in her throat that sealed and unsealed with each breath like the gill of some deep-sea creature. Around the opening, her skin had taken on a faint luminescence that matched the strange glow emanating from the polymer tracks that were visible beneath her scalp. Dr. Kessler stood at the foot of their slabs, arms outstretched in a gesture that was part crucifixion, part resurrection, part simple megalomania. His latex gloves were fresh and unstained, pulled tight over hands that trembled with barely contained excitement. But the blood on his surgical apron had dried and darkened to the color of old rust, creating stiff patterns across the fabric that looked less like the random spatters of surgery and more like deliberate designs, hieroglyphs written in the life essence of his victims, telling stories of transformation and transcendence that only he could read. His face had taken on the rapturous expression of a religious fanatic witnessing divine revelation. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air of the chamber, and his eyes held the fervent glow of absolute conviction. This was his moment of triumph, the culmination of years of research and countless failed experiments that had led to this perfect synthesis of science and madness. "You are no longer human," he proclaimed, his voice trembling with barely contained ecstasy, each word delivered like a verse from some twisted scripture. "The creatures you were, Marco, Emily, they died on these tables. What stands before me now are the first of the new flesh, vessels of pure consciousness liberated from the tyranny of mortality. You cannot rot. You cannot decay. You cannot die unless your physical matrix is completely destroyed, and even then, the patterns of your thoughts will persist in the polymer substrate forever." He stepped closer, his movements taking on the ceremonial quality of a priest approaching an altar. "Do you understand the magnitude of what I have accomplished? The old myth spoke of gods breathing life into clay, of divine sparks animating dust. But they were primitive metaphors, crude approximations of scientific truth. I have taken that dust and purified it through fire and chemistry, poured it into a new mold that transcends the limitations of mere biology." His hands pressed against his chest with theatrical reverence, fingers spread wide as if trying to contain the beating of a heart that had been transformed by proximity to his own creation. "I am your maker, your architect, your God. Every thought you think exists because I willed it into being. Every memory you retain has been preserved by my polymer, crystallized into eternal permanence by my design. You are the witnesses of my own genesis, my Adam and Eve, born not from rib and earth but from scientific perfection." Emily sat up with a movement that defied the normal mechanics of human motion, too smooth, too deliberate, like a marionette being pulled upright by invisible strings operated by a master puppeteer. The motion had no hesitation, no awkward adjustment for balance or orientation. She simply transitioned from horizontal to vertical as if gravity had been temporarily suspended for her convenience. He reached for the first syringe, holding it up to the light to check for air bubbles with the careful attention of a legitimate medical professional. The fluid inside was clear but viscous, moving like liquid glass when he tilted the barrel. "My polymer blend," he explained conversationally, as if discussing the weather instead of the contents of a madman's laboratory. 7 years of research, hundreds of test subjects, all leading to this perfect moment. It bonds with neural tissue at the molecular level, creating a matrix that preserves not just the physical structure, but the electrical patterns that create thought, memory, consciousness. When he plunged the needle directly into Emily's exposed brain tissue, her entire body convulsed with such violence that the steel table shook on its foundations. The restraints held, but just barely, leather straps stretching and metal joints shrieking under the strain. Her back arched so severely that Marco could hear vertebrae popping, and foam flecked with blood began to form at the corners of her mouth around the breathing tube. The liquid hissed as it spread through the brain tissue, and Marco could actually see it happening, watch as the clear polymer infiltrated the gray matter like some alien infection, creating crystalline pathways that caught and reflected light. Emily's sobs dissolved into strangled gasps that came in rhythm with the machine that was breathing for her, each exhalation carrying a sound like tearing silk. "The beautiful thing about conscious preservation," Kessler continued, drawing up another syringe, "is that the subject experiences every moment of the transformation. Every neural pathway being encased, every synapse being locked in eternal firing, all of it preserved in perfect, agonizing detail. She can feel her thoughts crystallizing, her memories being set in polymer amber forever." Marco could do nothing but watch as the doctor worked with methodical precision, inserting thin glass tubes into the soft folds of Emily's brain like some obscene acupuncture. Each insertion brought fresh convulsions, sounds that weren't quite screams and weren't quite laughter. Kessler pumped more of the polymer through the tubes, and Marco could see it spreading like luminous veins through the brain tissue, creating patterns that pulsed with their own sick light. The polymer bubbled faintly where it met living tissue, giving off a chemical reek that burned the nose and throat like inhaled fire. The smell was wrong in ways that transcended mere offense. It was the scent of life being transformed into something that had never existed in nature, consciousness being poisoned with permanence. Emily's eyes had rolled back in her head, showing only whites that were shot through with burst blood vessels. But Kessler leaned close to her face, studying her with the intensity of an artist examining his masterpiece. Still conscious, he reported with satisfaction. The polymer preserves awareness even as it transforms the substrate. She can feel everything, the burning, the crystallization, the slow transformation of her thoughts into something eternal and perfect. When the doctor finally turned to Marco, he was spattered with blood and cerebrospinal fluid from crown to knee, but his smile was radiant with the joy of completed work. Behind him, Emily lay still except for the mechanical rise and fall of her chest, her exposed brain now a web of crystalline pathways that pulsed with unnatural light. "Your turn," Kessler said, selecting a fresh saw blade from his tray of instruments. The blade gleamed like a silver smile, its teeth designed for the specific task of opening skulls while keeping their contents viable. "I do hope you've been paying attention to the process. You'll want to appreciate every detail of what's about to happen to you." Marco fought with everything he had left, throwing his body against the restraints until his shoulders nearly dislocated, feeling ligaments stretch and tear under the strain. The metal cuffs cut deeper into his wrists, and he could feel tendons starting to separate from bone, but the bonds held with the inexorable strength of engineering designed for exactly this purpose. His struggles only served to entertain Kessler, who watched with the pleased attention of a parent watching a child's first steps. The saw bit into Marco's skull anyway, the blade finding the marked line on his scalp with surgical precision. Pain came as a white flash that swallowed everything, not the sharp pain of a cut or the deep ache of a bruise, but something that transcended normal sensation entirely. It was as if his skull had been filled with lightning, every nerve ending in his head firing at once in a symphony of agony that redefined his understanding of what suffering could be. He tasted electricity on his tongue, felt the spray of his own blood on his lips as the saw worked through bone that had never been meant to part. The vibration traveled through his skull and into his brain, making his thoughts fragment and scatter like startled birds. He could feel pieces of himself flying away with each turn of the blade, memories and dreams becoming airborne debris in the mechanical hurricane of the saw. He stayed conscious just long enough to feel the first wave of molten fire as Kessler's polymer invaded his thoughts, a living burn inside his skull that felt like every neuron was being dipped in acid. The sensation was beyond physical pain. It was the feeling of his very self being dissolved and reconstituted in some hellish parody of resurrection. He could feel his memories crystallizing, becoming permanent exhibits in the museum of his own mind. Somewhere, through the haze of transformation, he heard Emily, not her voice, which had been silenced by the breathing apparatus, but her breath itself, ragged and shallow, syncing with his own in some twisted harmony. The sound became his anchor to what remained of humanity, two dying animals sharing their last moments in the dark. He clung to that sound as the world narrowed to heat and pain and the inexorable spread of the polymer through his consciousness. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was Dr. Kessler leaning close, blood-smeared surgical goggles reflecting Marco's wide, dilated eyes. In those reflections, he could see himself becoming something else, something that would remain conscious and aware for eternity, trapped in a crystalline prison of his own thoughts. "Perfect," Kessler whispered, his voice full of the satisfaction of work completed and dreams fulfilled. "Absolutely perfect." Then the darkness swallowed Marco whole, though he remained terrifyingly aware that this mercy was only temporary. In Kessler's laboratory, even oblivion had been conquered, and consciousness was forever. Emily and Marco stood over the remains in perfect stillness, their faces unreadable masks that revealed nothing of whatever thoughts moved through their now crystallized consciousness. The transformation had burned away their capacity for basic human emotion, replacing it with something cleaner, more efficient, but also infinitely more alien. Then, without exchanging a word or glance, they turned and walked toward the chamber's exit. The heavy steel door, which had seemed so impregnable when they were human, now yielded to their touch like paper, the metal warping and tearing under their enhanced strength. They stepped through the opening into a corridor that stretched away into darkness, their footsteps silent on concrete floors that had absorbed the suffering of countless victims. The night outside smelled of rain and iron, ozone, and distant decay. The world spread out before them, vast and empty and pregnant with possibilities they had never been able to perceive when they were merely human. Street lights flickered like dying stars, and in the distance, the city sprawled across the landscape like a circuit board designed by madmen, its patterns of light and shadow speaking to senses they hadn't possessed until Kessler's transformation awakened them. And somewhere far behind them, in the chamber that had been their chrysalis and their birthplace, the drain continued its mechanical operation, sucking the blood down into the building's foundation, down into the earth itself, as if the planet had opened its mouth to swallow the remains of the false god who had dared to create life in his own twisted image. The sound echoed through empty corridors like a hymn, a requiem, a promise of hungers yet to be satisfied.